Welcome everyone on Thinking Equally, the newly launched podcast of the Graduate Inequality Review, a student publication based in the Department of Social Policy and Intervention at the University of Oxford. We are excited and honored to welcome Dr. Nhat An Trinh on our episode today to talk about her research on inequality. Nhat An is a research officer at the Institute for New Economic Thinking and the Department of Social Policy and Intervention, and the research fellow of Nuffield College, University of Oxford. Previously, Nhat An was a research fellow at the Department of Social Sciences at Humboldt University, Berlin. She holds a DPhil in social policy from the University of Oxford. Her research focuses on trends, causes, and consequences of social inequality from an intra- and intergenerational perspective. Nhat An, thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited to talk to you about what motivates your research, sources of social inequality, and social class and mobility.
Thanks for having me, Emma.
Thank you. So my first question is just what motivated you to research social inequality?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think I have to go a little bit back to that. So I actually studied political philosophy, or like philosophy and economics, with a main focus on political philosophy. So rather conceptual and theoretical. And there I was mainly concerned with theories of distributional justice. So how can we morally justify inequalities? Who should get what? And I then increasingly became interested in how inequalities can actually be addressed by policy, or to what extent these theories of distributional justice are put into action by welfare states and public policy more widely. So I got interested in social policy, but in order for to develop good social policies, we actually also need to have a good understanding of the extent of inequalities and its drivers. And with a combination in the interest, with a combination in the of an interest in the impact of family background on individuals' outcomes, I started essentially doing a PhD on intergenerational social mobility and its historical trends and causes. And I mean, to some extent, that was, that comes from my interest in political philosophy, but also from my own family background. I always had this interest into how the family and parents affect people's life chances. So my parents, for instance, came to Germany as refugees from Vietnam, and I was born in Germany. So that was kind of something that was always very present to me. And then after pursuing the PhD, one thing led to the other, really. And so I got really passionate about researching inequalities.
No, that's amazing. And thank you so much for sharing. You have done so much research already. And I was wondering, based on, what your findings are, but also, of course, your studies, how does inequality accumulate over the life course and transmit across generations? This is like a huge question. But if you can maybe give us a few pointers to how to maybe think about this. And I guess here you can talk about the sources of inequality and also the life course aspect
Yes.
of inequality. But I will just let you to elaborate.
Okay. So let me maybe start with the accumulation of inequalities over the life course before looking at the transmission across generations. So when we think about accumulation, there's this idea, or sociologists, but also other social scientists like economists, there's this pattern of, or this phenomenon called the Matthew effect of cumulative advantage. So the idea is here, people who start off unequally and those who are actually in a better position over their life course, they will be able to attain better and better positions, whereas those who start off at a lower point or are more disadvantaged, they are unable to keep up, so that inequalities actually increase the longer people or like over the course of people's lives. So you can think of a person, for instance, that has good grades in school, right? And with these good grades in school, this person is able to enter the university and get a degree. And with this university education, then this person is likely to move and get a well-paying job. And with this well-paying job, this person is able to save and buy a house and accumulate wealth over the life course. And when they reach old age and retirement, they're likely to sit on a very safe financial cushion and have high economic security. And so you can see with this example that one thing leads to the other, so that people who have a advantage position from early on, like good grades in school, they can build on this. And those who don't, they can't, so that you have kind of this increasing gap over time. And when we think now about the transmission across generations, so intergenerational transmission, thinking about how parents affect or transmit their resources onto their children, we can think about different types of resources. So economic, these are earnings, wealth, social. So we think here about networks or social capital or other cultural resources. And the idea here is really that parents who have more of these kinds of resources, they can use these resources to help their children do better in school, for instance, and then reaching or having these good grades in school and then attaining the trajectories that I outlined earlier. So this is one way through which parents can help their children do well and therefore also transmit their advantages intergenerationally. But parents can also actually directly affect their children's labor market attainment, for instance, by helping them to get similar jobs due to their own experience. So think about like doctors, like if you have a father or a mother who's a doctor, they have certain experiences and networks that can help you go through the exam, for instance, to medical school, to also do well in job talks, and they just know better how to navigate this compared to children whose parents are not doctors or who come from a family where nobody has actually attained university education before. So these people will have it much harder. But parents can also maybe, due to having their own firms and businesses, allow their children to work in these or provide the conditions for their children to own like a business themselves in the future, or like taking over that family firm. And the easiest way through which actually parents can transfer their resources is through wealth, because wealth is a resource that can be directly transmitted via inheritances and financial gifts. This is different to like occupations, educational degrees, or earnings and income. So this is something very particular about wealth, and I'm looking in my research on how parents do this. So how parents divide inheritances and gifts among their children, to what kind of inequalities this leads. And yeah, so this intergenerational transmission is also one key mechanism through which wealth or the transmission through gifts and inheritance is one key mechanism through which wealth is transmitted, and how advantage and disadvantages come about intergenerationally.
Yeah. No, that's such a good overview, and really closely linked to my research interest. So it's so exciting to hear you talk about so nicely and summarizing these big issues. And then I guess as a next question, I would love to ask you how, like, based on so how can social mobility be researched, and who has better chances to be upwardly socially mobile, which is also a huge question. But I guess what we are talking about here is also social mobility. So if we are talking about inequality and how it transmits across generations, we also want to think about, if one comes from a specific class background, what is the likelihood of ending up in a different one? And of course, research is always more exciting when it's about upward social mobility, but some may say that what we can see now is more downward social mobility. But I will let you, the expert, talk about this. But yeah, so how can social mobility be researched? Because there's also multiple ways and I guess puzzles with definitions of social mobility. And then, in your opinion, or based on your research or findings, who has better chances to be upwardly socially mobile?
Yeah, thank you so much, Emma. I think it's very important actually to firstly think about how social mobility can actually be researched. So to think about the methodological challenges behind it. And I think, and you said this already, a lot comes down to actually definitions. And social mobility in general can be understood as changes in one's social position, and social position can be measured in different ways. So economists are generally interested in earnings and income. Sociologists are interested in social class position or social status or some other form of occupational attainment. Education is also very important. And lately, the literature and research has moved to looking at intergeneration or social mobility in wealth. So social mobility as changes in social outcomes or socioeconomic outcomes. But you also have to make a distinction between, is it social mobility between generations or within one's lifetime? And there as I said, you can either look at differences in social positions, or you can look at social mobility between generations. So that would be parents and children, and this is referred to as intergenerational mobility. Or you can look at it within the course of one's lifetime. And we previously touched a little bit about how inequalities change or accumulate over the life course. And this is then referred to intragenerational social mobility. And I actually have worked on both. But I think, so let me focus on the intergenerational part, because this is also what I kind of focus mostly on. So here we are interested in how parents do and their children do, or how children with certain, like who come from different types of family or with different family backgrounds, how well do they do. And this actually has quite high data demands. So I work quantitatively, meaning that I employ statistical analyses and econometric methods to analyze this. And in order to have a good understanding of intergenerational social mobility, the demands on data are actually quite high, because we have to have good data on both generations, which are the parents and their children. And this is not often the case. So it's actually quite difficult. So we have certain surveys. So I mostly work with surveys that contain questions on the respondents themselves or individuals, and then they answer questions on their parents retrospectively. Sometimes we are lucky that we can link parents directly to their children, so we can observe the parents as well, in addition to the children, and do not need to rely on information given by the children. But this is rather rare. And then there's another conceptual concern. How do we define social mobility in terms of absolute or relative? So this is a crucial distinction. So absolute mobility is can be understood as, or is defined as, the difference, the absolute difference between, say, a mother's and her child's social position, her class position, for instance. But the thing is, if we are looking at two generations, the child's social position can be different from their mother's, just because of structural changes between these two generations. So if we're, for instance, interested in social class, then it could be that the class structure has changed for the child compared to her mother, and just by that, this child will have a different social class position. But when we look at their position within the hierarchy of the class position, actually the relative position of the child has actually not changed so much compared to their mother. And this phenomenon where one tries to subtract the distribution of or the differences in the distribution of class position, there we are then interested, or that shows us the strength in the association between the parent and the child's position. And this is often called relative mobility or social fluidity. So how easy or how fluid and how easy individuals can move between the ranks within earnings, income, education, or, as I said, social class positions. And if we have a concern for upward social mobility, then we are looking at absolute social mobility, because only with respect to absolute mobility can we can actually make judgments and observations about, has somebody moved up or have they moved down? But as I said, if we observe absolute mobility to improve, for instance, between two generations, that can be achieved through structural changes like economic growth or changes in the occupational structure, but everyone will likely move up in this case, so that the inequalities that are between the generations are not that different. So if we want to reduce inequality and improve equality of opportunity, so we want to loosen the association between one's own social destination compared to one's parents, so kind of weakening the relationship between social position and family background, then we need to look at relative mobility rates or social fluidity. And a key characteristic that one needs to take into account with relative mobility is that it is a zero-sum game. So for someone to move up, some other person needs to move down. So I think this is something that sometimes in the political debate is not often taken into account. But I think there's both merits to look at both absolute as well as relative mobility. So now you also asked me about who has better chances to move upwardly social, to be upwardly socially, to be upwardly socially mobile. And given what we said about cumulative advantage and a better starting position, it becomes actually quite clear that those from more advantaged families will have it easier to move further upward compared to those from less advantaged families, all else being equal. But for those who have actually attained already advantaged positions, there will also be a ceiling at some point, because they then can't move further if they have already attained the highest position. But then, like, normally what we see and also observe, what I observe is that families will then be concerned about keeping their advantaged positions, which will have also effects on those from more disadvantaged families to move upward. Because, yeah, if they keep their positions, nobody's moving down for those from the lower positions to move up again.
Thank you. Wow, a lot of so interesting points, and I guess with the review of elite studies, it's also interesting to see how that top end of the distribution is also changing, because some may even argue that yes, of course, it's a zero-sum game, but some people are stuck in the middle, kind of the middle class, and then some people, 1% or 0.1% are even able to expand their wealth. So that's also I guess an interesting thing to look into, but it's kind of a bit other way of looking at inequalities and wealth distribution. But I mean, a bit still connected to social mobility and what you just described, but more about earning trajectories, and you done some research on basically on what other than individual motivation and hard work do people's earning trajectories depend. And do gender, one's own or parents' occupation, education play a role? I assume based on what you already told us, they must play some role. But if you can maybe elaborate on this, on different factors other than motivation and hard work, basically influencing one's earning trajectories.
Yes, thank you very much. So earnings trajectories are how earnings develop over people's life course. So will they grow? Will they stay flat? Or will they vary in a certain way? And there's lots of other factors, I would say, rather than motivation and hard work, that influences how these earnings develop as people progress in their careers. So you touched upon gender, and there's clear evidence showing that men and women have rather different earnings trajectories. This is mainly to different levels of labor market attachment. So for instance, women are more likely to work part-time jobs, primarily due to care and family responsibilities. And there's evidence, and some of my work is also showing that part-time work has some impact on how earnings develop over the life course. So women working in part-time jobs compared to full-time working women, they will have normally less pronounced earnings growth, and also lower levels of earnings. But we also know that women are still discriminated in the labor market, as reflected in the gender pay gap. So gender is certainly like a critical factor influencing how one is enumerated in the labor market. Occupational positions or class positions, both one earns as well as one parents also exert an influence. So research that I conducted with colleagues on this also show that those in salaried positions, so professional and managers, have not only higher levels, but also steeper earnings growth over the life course, but interestingly also greater variability or fluctuation. And this is related to their specific employment relations, where the idea is that salaried and professional workers are enumerated in a different way, which has a more long-term prospect. And so that compared to people in working class positions, they will experience greater earnings growth. And I mean, when you think about occupational positions and its effects, you could then think about also the role of education, where education is having then a more indirect effect by affecting the occupational positions that people can reach. But an important bit is here also to say that the extent to which educational credentials are rewarded in the labor market also critically depends on the structure of the labor market and its institutional context. So, for instance, in the UK, there's compared to other countries, a rather weak link between education degrees and the jobs that you do. So you can, for instance, have a degree in art history or English literature, but you can still go to the city and then take up a job in finance or in tech in London. Whereas, for instance, in other countries, for instance, like Germany, you have a very, very close link between the education and occupational system. So you need to have a certain certificate or a certain educational degree to do a certain type of job. And so the educational program or degree that you're doing is also setting you on a certain trajectory with respect to your labor market career that affects your earnings prospects and how it develops over time. But these are just like, I think, yeah, just to mention these factors that you also touched upon.
No, thank you so much. Thank you. Yes, and I also do wonder, of course, the link is in this regard, maybe in terms of subjects studied is weaker in the UK between education and then the labor market outcomes. But I do wonder if there is other institutional credentials or educational institutions credentials that count. So maybe it's only the Russell Group universities or some type of other variation that that whatever degree or subject you have a degree in, you can still apply for different positions. But that's another debate. But
absolutely. So just
but it's certainly really interesting to see some or like hear about some like country or regional differences and variability in this. And then coming to the end a bit, of course, you have a DPhil in social policy, and you mentioned in the beginning as well that you were interested in public policy and policies of the welfare state, and how do they affect inequalities and all of these topics of social mobility and inequalities that we touched on. So I was wondering, what are examples of effective policy interventions that were able to reduce wealth inequality or create more social mobility? I will let you decide on the specifics, but if you can share any such policy interventions that you would consider to be effective.
Yeah, so I think when we think about social mobility, and this has been discussed actually quite widely, there's evidence showing that educational policy interventions, but also the education expansion that has been conducted in this country, but also elsewhere in the post-war period, has been actually quite effective in reducing educational inequality. So just allowing more people to go to attend it, to undergo education, to attend tertiary education institutions, to make it more accessible across the population, really. But we also have studies that now show that at some point, education expansion and the reduction of education inequalities has also hit a ceiling, because the more people are educated or highly educated, when we think about university education, the more education is also losing its value within the labor market. And this phenomenon is called educational inflation. And then it becomes a bit more nuanced on how education can actually help to improve social mobility. When we think about opportunities for more social mobility in terms of social class or the labor market, then I also already mentioned the upgrading of the occupational structure that we have also seen in many post-war in the post-war period in many post-industrial countries like the UK, which was driven by the creation of jobs at the top end of the occupational structure, leading to more upward mobility as people were able to enter better jobs. But whether this increased also social fluidity kind of remains contested in the literature. But this is more a historical trend rather than a real policy intervention. But it could show that by creating better jobs, by making, I think, there's some debate about making more room at the top. This will also help people transition into better jobs. And the debate in a paper that I actually also wrote that shows that by creating, labor markets have immensely changed over the last decades, and particularly with respect to precarious work. So here the focus was more at the lower end. There you can see that this was actually not very conducive to social mobility, and many people got actually stuck in these positions, and social policies that kind of stripped the welfare state, or through reform reduced benefits, social and unemployment benefits. They actually led to greater inequalities essentially between families, which then also translated into widening educational inequalities between their children. So I actually conducted an analysis using a huge German policy reform on this, which shows that, but from this we can actually learn maybe the other thing that by creating better jobs and making it possible for people to attain this, this may help to improve social mobility. And lastly, you also ask about wealth inequality. So I think here taxation is really an important factor, or something that public policy can do. So either directly taxing wealth or taxing inheritances and gifts. Unfortunately, many countries have nowadays abolished wealth tax, and there is some inheritance tax in most countries, but these are currently actually rather low also in comparison to how high they used to be 20, 30, 100 years ago.
Mhm.
And this is something actually quite worrisome, given that we have so high levels of wealth inequality.
Mhm. Thank you. What is one thing you want our audience to take away with themselves today?
One thing, okay, this is
After all the wisdom and
yeah, I think
nuance that you shared.
the main thing is really that inequalities are generated early on in
Mhm.
people's lives, and that the family is a key driver of social inequality. There are certain ways in which, and ways that, yeah, families with different types of resources behave. They have like better means to help their children do well, and this is something that's I don't think that policy can actually intervene or should intervene in.
Mhm.
But I think it's important to be aware of that, yeah, the family is just a great creator of inequality. So I think one important thing to think about reducing inequality is actually to reduce the inequalities between families in the first place.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nhat An Trinh, for coming on to our podcast of Thinking Equally and sharing all these experiences and insightful points regarding social mobility and wealth inequality and researching all these issues. Thank you once again, and we wish you a lovely rest of the day for our listeners and you too.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was great fun. Thank you.
Thank you.